Hello and welcome back. In this lesson, we're going to talk about Security Token Service, or otherwise referred to as STS. So over here in the Orion papers, let's click on STS, and let's dive in and talk a little bit about this particular service. So STS allows you to create temporary security credentials that grant trusted users access to your AWS resources. These temporary credentials are for short-term use and can be active for a few minutes to several hours. However, once expired, they can no longer be used to access your AWS resources. So let's jump back out here and take a look at our IAM diagram to see where this fits into everything. So when we think about STS, right, we want to think about short-term temporary credentials that we use to grant access to our AWS resources for either AWS services like an EC2 instance or for IAM users in a different AWS account or through Web Identity Federation, which I'll talk a little bit about more in a minute. But taking a look at the diagram here, right, if we want to access our S3 bucket, an EC2 instance has to have a role attached to it. Now, a role actually gets its temporary credentials from STS. So STS is the basis for granting permissions for an AWS resource through an IAM role. But also when we talk about non-AWS account holders or AWS account holders in a separate account, if you want to grant them permission to your AWS resources, you have to give them temporary access. So that's all done through STS, or Security Token Service. So when requested through an STS API call, credentials are returned with three components: a security token, an access key ID, and a secret key ID. Now, it's important to know that the only way to request these types of credentials is through an API call. There is no way in the console to go through and actually use STS in the console to generate credentials. It's done through API calls only when the request is made. So what are some of the benefits of using STS? Why do you want to use this? Well, there's no distributing or embedding long-term AWS security credentials in an application. So again, let's go back out to our diagram here. If we have an application running on an EC2 instance, and we want that application to access other AWS resources, we don't have to embed credentials in the application code itself. We can just, using STS, grant temporary credentials to the application when it wants to make the request to our AWS resource. So we can have that resource available only for a few minutes, or in other words, only have those API credentials available for a few minutes. And then once the EC2 instance or the application is done accessing the resources, those credentials expire. So you don't have to worry about managing those credentials. They're dynamically generated when the API call is made by the application to access resources, say in our S3 bucket, and then they will automatically expire. So you don't have to worry about changing them in and out or having to manage or create them yourself. It can all be done dynamically and automatically by integrating it with STS. We can also grant access to AWS resources without having to grant an IAM identity to them. So again, it can be a user outside of our AWS network, or it can be an AWS user in a separate AWS account. So you can grant them temporary access without having to go into IAM yourself and having to create a user and provide them with credentials, right? It's temporary credentials to give temporary access to your AWS resources for people that are not currently IAM account holders in your own AWS account. And again, STS is the basis for IAM roles and identity federation. Now, since the credentials are temporary, you don't have to, again, rotate or revoke them. So this is one of the main benefits. We don't have to manage them. We don't have to rotate them. They're just dynamically generated and used for a very short amount of time by the resource that is making the request. So you decide how long they are active for, which again can be just a few minutes up to several hours. So when should you use STS? Well, it's great for identity federation. So we talk about identity federation. There's enterprise identity federation. This is where we want to authenticate through your company's network. So this means that STS supports security assertion markup language, or SAML, which allows for use with Microsoft Active Directory or your own identity federation solutions. There's also Web Identity Federation. This is where we use third-party identity providers like Facebook, Google, or Amazon. I'm sure you've downloaded some sort of a mobile app and it's asked you to log in using Facebook, Google, or Amazon account. So what's happening there is that is a trusted identity provider. And so that is going to verify the identity, and then it's going to request credentials from STS. Once they've been verified, STS will then give those credentials to that verified user, and that verified user can then access your AWS resources or the specific AWS resources that you're granting them access to use. So that is how STS is used in Identity Federation with both Enterprise Identity Federation and Web Identity Federation. It's also used for roles for cross-account access. So I mentioned this earlier, but this is used for organizations that may have more than one AWS account. A lot of times companies will have a developer account and a production account. And obviously there's going to be IAM users in both that want to be able to access resources in either AWS account. So again, we can use STS to provide those temporary credentials that can be used to access those resources without having to generate duplicate IAM user accounts in both of those AWS accounts. And again, as I mentioned earlier, it can also be used for roles for Amazon EC2 and other AWS services, right? So we want to grant access to an application running on an EC2 instance to other AWS services without having to embed the credentials. So again, we can just pop back out here to the diagram. We have an application running on EC2, and we want to be able to access an S3 bucket. Well, we can assign an IAM role, and the IAM role is going to pull the credentials from STS. And if we have individuals or applications that are not currently set up within our AWS infrastructure, meaning that they're not IAM users inside of our AWS account, we can use Web Identity Federation through a third-party provider like Facebook, Google, or Amazon, or Enterprise Web Identity Federation through something like Microsoft Active Directory. And what we can do then is have temporary credentials created for them as they request access to our AWS resources. So also over here, you're going to notice that I listed out the current API calls for STS. Now, I would just say for this particular exam, I would write these down and memorize each of these particular API calls and what they're for, just so you have them in your back pocket in case they are asked for on the exam. So again, just a quick recap. STS is what allows you to create temporary security credentials to grant users access to your AWS resources. And the main benefits is no distributing or embedding long-term AWS security credentials inside of an application, because again, these are temporary, they're short-lived, and they're generated dynamically when requested. And with that, we will conclude this lesson. Thank you for watching. You may now move on.